Now it is my pleasure and my honor to introduce you Nien-hê Hsieh. He is Kim Clark, Professor of Business Administration at Harvard Business School and also Director of the Edmond Safra Center for Ethics at the same institution. Nien-hê is an economist by teaching. He received his BA in economics in 1992 at Swarthmore College in Pennsylvania. Then his master in politics at Oxford University in 1994. And then in 2000, his PhD in economics at Harvard University. In 2001, he was appointed assistant professor of business ethics at Wharton School, where he was also director of the Wharton ethics program. And in 2013, he was appointed associate professor of business administration at Harvard Business School, and he received his full professorship in 2019. He's currently editor of the Oxford International Review, and he's at the editorial board of the Business and Human Rights Journal. He was former member of several editorial boards, for example, at Business Ethics Quarterly and the Business Ethics Journal Review. He received several rewards and honors, 16 in my count, and he has published around 100 journal articles, inter alia on business and human rights, workplace democracy, and Rawls' theory of the property-owning democracy. And he published it in the most prestigious journals of our discipline, for example, Business Ethics Quarterly, the Journal of Social Philosophy, and Economics and Philosophy. Now today, he will discuss with us the topic of inclusive capitalism. And we talked earlier about that, and I told him that to many Germans, the very term inclusive capitalism is an oxymoron, something that simply does not fit together. How can capitalism ever be inclusive? And Nien-hê, it's a pleasure, it's an honor to have you here, and the stage is yours. Please come.
Very kind. Thank you very much for that very generous introduction. I should correct one fact in the introduction. Professor Altheimer mentioned that I had written over 100 journal articles. That's not exactly not entirely correct. Many of those articles are actual cases, which are not journal articles. But nonetheless, thank you very much for that generous introduction, and thank you for being here with me this afternoon and for the invitation to be part of this incredible 550-year anniversary celebration. So, inclusive capitalism may sound like an oxymoron, and so I very much hope to be able to engage with you to see where the idea works and where the idea doesn't. And so to motivate my talk, let me just start off with a number of slides sort of pointing out the state of affairs as far as inequality is concerned around the world. So here is regional income distribution in 2021. The gray bars represent the bottom 50%. The middle bars are blue with the middle 40%. And the red bars are the top 10%. And so as you can see, we have quite a wide dispersion across countries, but basically it sends home the message, right, as far as how great income inequality is. If you look at wealth inequality, it's even worse in terms of inequality, right? Where the top 10% control basically close to 60% of the wealth in most regions. And if you look at global income shares, right, it's pretty much stayed the same. But if you look at wealth, right, we actually see an increase potentially in the inequality in wealth in Europe and the United States, and certainly there's an increase in inequality in wealth in the BRICS. So here, this is the share owned by the top 1%, close to over 50% in South Africa, and in the case of India, for example, basically around 30%. Right? So just to give you a sense, right, of the topic of my talk, right, which is about income and wealth inequality around the world. And then here are some projections about where we will be by 2100 in terms of the top 0.1% owning basically over 30% of the world's wealth, and the bottom 50% basically under 5%. So I hope that gives you some sense, right, of the context in which my talk is placed. And now that I've shown you a bunch of statistics, data, unlike Professor Wuppermann yesterday, right, or unlike our earlier talk this morning, I am not going to engage in any discussion about statistics, right, or any empirical research. Because my talk today is really on the side of what we talk about, the ideas side of things, as was mentioned this morning. And what I really want to do today is to basically articulate an idea, which is what I call inclusive capitalism, right? And try to make the case for it in a way that I hope will maybe help shape the debate around inequality in wealth and income around the world. So inclusive capitalism is an economic system that maintains the widespread ownership of the means of production to ensure that no member of society is excluded from fully participating in and benefiting from economic activity. Okay? And when I say that, I want to share with you an idea, right? And discuss with you a way to frame that idea. What I mean by this is that inclusive capitalism in some sense, right, the idea that you have widespread ownership of the means of production, right, that in itself, right, is not a new idea, right, nor is that an idea that is lacking for various kinds of justification or argument, right. So what I want to do today is to articulate the idea of widespread ownership of capital in terms of the idea of inclusive capitalism, right? And present a way to frame or argue for this idea in a way that I hope will be helpful in shaping discussions going forward. Because as we discussed this morning, right, while ideas are important, it's just as important how they are in some sense presented, right, and shared in the effort to try to get their uptake in discussions around the world. So that is what I hope we can do today. And the approach that I will take is to basically engage different audiences, right? And so in some sense, the idea of inclusive capitalism is meant to respond to existing debates and approaches that are taken in these various audiences with a way to help try to reframe those discussions or debates. So the first audience is business. And by that I mean basically management scholars, business leaders, and people involved in that kind of discussion, right? So many of you here are students in the context of business, so this would be you as part of the audience. The second audience is socialism, right? Because when we talk about the widespread ownership of the means of production, right, it's impossible not to, right, have to engage with socialism, which involves the collective ownership of the means of production. And so that's the second audience that I hope to engage, and engaging arguments there for the collective ownership, right, rather than the private ownership of the means of production. And then thirdly, I want to engage liberalism, right? So there the idea of widespread ownership of private property has been put forward, but present an argument that is slightly different from the ways in which it's been discussed, in the hope that it will become more widely taken up. So that's kind of what the hope I will do in the context of our discussion today, sort of work through responses to each of these audiences on the question of the ownership of the means of production, and then come to a conclusion. First audience, business. So we all know the famous Friedman saying, there is one and only one social responsibility of business: to use its resources and engage in activities designed to increase its profits so long as it stays within the rules of the game, right? Commonly referred to as shareholder primacy. And if we look at the data over the last 25 years, right, and we think about the slides that I suggested earlier, actually, I kind of made a mistake. I said I was not going to talk any more about data, and I apologize for that misstatement. I basically lied to you. It reminds me of an old joke. My students often ask me, why did you end up teaching ethics? And I tell them, well, there's this old saying that George Bernard Shaw had in Man and Superman, which is that those who can't do, teach. So if we look here, we see where the vast majority of corporate revenue, right, enters into the rest of the economy. Right? So the red is the share of corporate revenue that goes to labor income and the change over the last 25 years. Black is the share that goes to capital income, and the percentages reflect the growth, right, in the extent to which corporate revenue has gone to corporate income, right, over the last 25 years. Right? So it's not difficult to understand the connection that one would make between the shareholder primacy view, right, and the kind of inequality, right, that we saw earlier with regard to income and wealth. Right? So it's basically, this is one way to understand, right, a large part of the growth of that inequality. And so in response, right, a number of people put forward what you might call alternatives to shareholder primacy. Right? I've sort of put up here a variety of kinds of approaches that people have articulated in the business and in management literature as alternatives to shareholder primacy. Right? And they basically could be called versions of stakeholder theory. Right? The idea is that rather than simply benefit capital owners, right, the idea is that corporate revenue ought to be shared in other ways with other stakeholders, such as increasing, say, the labor share of income, right, or increasing consumer surplus, or payments to suppliers, or the like. So that, in a nutshell, is, I think, the way that the business world has responded to the challenge of growing inequality in wealth and income, right, by trying to shift from a shareholder primacy model, right, to what you might call versions of stakeholder theory, or what's often called stakeholder capitalism. And my response to that is that, not to suggest that that's a problematic approach to take, and I'm more than happy to discuss the merits of that approach, but I think the one thing that's missing in the discussion on the side of business and management is the very basic way in which it is, right, that the system tends to favor capital owners, right? Sort of actually overlooks, right, not just the question of the benefits to various stakeholders, but the question is actually, well, who actually is a shareholder? And in some sense, the idea was articulated by G.K. Chesterton. He may be familiar with some of you, sort of an English writer from the 19th, 20th century, who said, too much capitalism does not mean too many capitalists, but too few. Right. And so in sharing this idea with you, the thought is to suggest that in the context of business and management, right, in addition to thinking about stakeholder capitalism, right, we need to think about capitalism itself and who, in fact, right, counts as a capitalist if we are really to address the question of widespread inequality with regard to income and wealth. So that is the engagement with the first audience. Second audience is socialism. And as I suggested to you at the start of my talk, it's impossible not to engage with socialism simply because socialism is about how we think about the distribution of the ownership of capital and who owns it. Right? My discussion and engagement with socialism here in this audience will be largely motivated by engaging with liberal egalitarian political philosophy. Okay, so it's a slightly different way of thinking about when you think about socialism. There are lots of different ways into the discussion. Right? The way into the discussion that I'd like to pursue in the context of this talk, and which I will pursue in the context of my work, is through thinking about it in the context of Anglo-American liberal political philosophy, and basically that brings us to John Rawls. Right? So John Rawls, made famous for his theory of justice, widely regarded as one of the great political philosophers of the 20th century, tried to articulate an account of justice where justice is the first virtue of social institutions as truth is of systems of thought. Right? And his discussion, as came forward in some of the panel discussions after our keynote discussion, has been taken up largely as somebody who defended the welfare state. Right? But Rawls, in his writing, says, if I were writing a theory of justice now, there are two things I would handle differently. One concerns how to present the argument from the original position, which is a large part of his argument, and quite a significant part of his argument. So it's quite significant that he would hold that as one of the two things that he would revise. But he also said, another revision I would now make is to distinguish more sharply the idea of property-owning democracy from the idea of a welfare state. So the fact that Rawls, right, of the two things that he would handle differently, where one of them was basically the core of his argument with respect to the original position, that the second one should be to try to distinguish more carefully between welfare state capitalism, right, and property-owning democracy, always struck me as something quite significant, and yet something that we don't explore enough about. And so that is the entryway into thinking about the question of socialism, as I hope to make clear. He says, these ideas, right, the idea of a capital welfare state, so welfare state capitalism, which is a society in which you could imagine we have sort of roughly free market capitalism, but then highly redistributive taxation, right, and then benefits extended to individuals who may not be as well off, right. That and property-owning democracy, right, which is a system that has widespread ownership of capital, but is privately owned, so it's not socialism. He says, these ideas are quite different, but since they both allow private property and productive assets, we may be misled into thinking them essentially the same. To see the full force of the difference principle, it should be taken in the context of property-owning democracy or of a liberal socialist regime and not a welfare state. So just to sort of back up and provide more context, right? In his later work, Rawls basically compared 5 different kinds of economic regimes. So laissez-faire capitalism, right? Communism, right? With state control, right? Then welfare state capitalism, which is a system of private ownership, but with highly redistributive taxes and benefits, right? Then property-owning democracy, which is a society with widespread ownership of private capital, right? And then liberal socialism, right, which involves state ownership or public ownership of capital. Of those 5, right, what Rawls is saying is that basically only the last 2, property-owning democracy and liberal socialism, right, adequately meet the requirements of his theory of justice, right? And the problem was that people basically confused, right, I can't do this with my hands very easily, sort of welfare state capitalism and property-owning democracy, okay? So that's sort of the idea there. And so here's the argument that Rawls gives for why property-owning democracy is required for justice as opposed to welfare state capitalism. The intent, he says, is not simply to assist those who lost out through accident or misfortune, although that must be done, but rather to put all citizens in a position to manage their own affairs on a footing of a suitable degree of social and economic equality. Right? What Rawls is saying here is that welfare state capitalism is basically geared at trying to assist those who lost out through accident or misfortune. Right? Whereas property-owning democracy, right, is not simply about that, but also to put people in a position to manage their own affairs on a footing of a suitable degree of social and economic equality. The least advantaged, then, are not, if all goes well, the unfortunate and unlucky objects of our charity and compassion, much less our pity, but those to whom reciprocity is owed as a matter of political justice among those who are free and equal citizens along with everyone else. Although they control fewer resources, they are doing their full share on terms recognized by all as mutually advantageous and consistent with everyone's self-respect. Okay? So that's the argument that Rawls gives for why, if you are going to have a regime of private ownership of capital, right, welfare state capitalism, in which there's highly concentrated ownership of private capital, but large redistribution, doesn't satisfy the principles of justice, whereas property-owning democracy, while still a regime of private ownership of capital, because capital is widely dispersed in its ownership, does satisfy the principles of justice. Okay. So examples of what might qualify as forms of property-owning democracy, we have real property ownership, right? So in the United States, at least, a very big source of people's wealth is in real property, but yet real property is highly unequal in terms of its distribution. Individual stock ownership, what you might call a universal basic dividend, which is in contrast to a universal basic income, right? The idea being that one earns a dividend by virtue of ownership in shares as opposed to receiving an income, which would be redistributive under welfare state capitalism. Cooperatives, entrepreneurship, community ownership. These are some of the examples that people have explored, right, as ways to try to realize the ideal of property-owning democracy. But some have said the case that Rawls makes for property-owning democracy actually pushes him, right, from the fourth option to the fifth. That ultimately, in the end, Rawls is a socialist, right? According to his argument for something like property-owning democracy over welfare state capitalism. And so William Edmondson writes, if society is a fair system of social cooperation, how can the property that is essential to everyone's productive activity not ultimately be the property of all cooperating members? Right? In other words, if the idea behind property-owning democracy is to put people in a position to manage their own affairs by owning capital, right, then ultimately shouldn't it be the case that capital is collectively owned and made available to all, thereby making Rawls no longer a proponent of private ownership of capital, but ultimately the proponent of public ownership of capital under something like liberal socialism. So what I want to do is simply just raise three questions that need to be discussed if we're going to try to understand to what extent should we understand Rawls and liberal egalitarianism more generally as arguing for something like private ownership of capital versus the public ownership of capital. And the first is, to what extent does an efficient allocation of capital count in favor of private ownership of capital? So this is a discussion that I'm sure does not need to be repeated here. It's basically about sort of coordination issues, planning, and how do we think about that. And so I think the first question is really to what extent, right, does an efficient allocation of capital count in favor of private ownership of capital, and that in some sense is largely an empirical question that needs to be debated and discussed. The second one is, does public ownership of capital risk overly subjugating economic life to the political? And the rough idea is this: if access to capital, right, under collective or state or public ownership, right, is required, then that basically subjugates in some sense decisions to political realm as opposed to the economic realm. So this is not a question about efficiency, right? This is simply a question about, should we have in society certain realms of activity, right, that are not entirely subjugated to the political, right? And so that's sort of a normative question, right, about do we want to preserve certain areas of social life, right, that are private as opposed to relegating them to the political realm. The third question then is, to what extent does the value of diversity count in favor of the private ownership of capital? And this is something that is something that's always been in the back of my mind. It's not something that I've been able to articulate very well, and it's not something that I've actually found discussed that much in the literature. But if we believe that diversity in and of itself has value, and diversity by which I mean broadly simply variety, right? If variety itself is a kind of value, right? Is that count in favor of the private ownership of capital as opposed to publicly owned capital? And so I have in mind sort of images of vibrant markets, right? Varieties of different kinds of things that people are producing, right? This is not to guarantee, the point is not that the private markets don't guarantee variety either, right? So you know, there's a great book by Joel Waldvogel on the tyranny of the market, right? But the point is that if we do value diversity in this sense, right, to what extent does it count in favor of the private ownership of capital? And so for me, these are open questions that then suggest that perhaps we should go back to thinking about property owning democracy, right, as a way to realize the principles of justice, right, where you have private ownership of capital and not simply the model of socialism. But that requires engaging with the argument for property owning democracy itself. And that brings me to the third audience, which is liberalism. So if we look at Rawls's argument for property owning democracy, he says that although the least advantaged control fewer resources, they are doing their full share on terms recognized by all as mutually advantageous and consistent with everyone's self-respect. Right? And underlying this, I think, is Rawls's concern that significant political and economic inequalities are often associated with inequalities of social status, right? That encourage those of lower status to be viewed both by themselves and by others as inferior, right? And this may arouse widespread attitudes of deference and servility on one side and a will to dominate on the other. And these effects of social and economic inequalities can be serious evils, and the attitudes they engender, great vices. So for Rawls, right, the concern seems to be that those who are least off under welfare state capitalism won't be seen as doing their full share in contributing to society, and therefore risk being subject to a kind of status inequality that's damaging to their conception of self-respect. So I want to engage with this argument and think about it from the perspective of inclusivity, the value that I mentioned before, which is the idea of not excluding anybody from participating in and benefiting from economic activity. And the place that I start that's helpful for this is just a very, very, very short observation, but I think one that we tend to forget, at least in the United States, maybe not elsewhere in the world, which is that owning capital is not a productive activity. Right? Owning itself is not a productive activity. Right? This doesn't mean that the application of capital is not productive. It clearly is. This does not mean, right, that deciding where to invest is not a kind of work. Right? This doesn't mean, right, that it's that one can simply, you know, not have to work in sort of managing their capital. Right? But the point is that the ownership itself is not the productive activity. Right? And what do I mean that? It's not work. Right? So work is something where we contribute our time, our effort, ourselves, perhaps even quite extensively in the context of, say, emotional or care work, right, in a way that involves transforming the world around us to the benefit of others. And so that, I would say, counts as a productive activity. But in the case of economic participation, right, owning capital allows one to earn, right, a certain degree of financial benefit, right, that often in some sense can be quite unlimited depending on how much capital one has, right, in a way that's quite different from the way in which one has to invest one's time, energy, and effort in the context of work, right, to earn financial benefits in the participation of economic activity. So all this is then to say then, the first question is ownership of capital required to do one's full share on terms recognized by all as mutually advantageous and consistent with everyone's self-respect? Right, so remember that the argument for property owning democracy, according to Rawls, is that the least off need to have some degree of ownership of capital in order to be able to participate in a way that to be seen as doing their full share on terms recognized by all as mutually advantageous. And while that may be true for something like, say, human capital, in terms of skills and training and things as such, I'm not so sure, right, that this really helps to make the case for why we need widespread distribution of ownership of the means of production. So think about, for example, talented musicians, right? Talented musicians, right? Incredibly, talented, provide great benefit and value to us all. Apart from having to own, like maybe say a really fancy violin like a Stradivarius, right? It's not clear how much it is about the actual ownership of capital itself that matters to their ability to engage in productive activity that is valued by other members of society, right? So many people in the professional class, right, provide valuable services to society that, again, may have resulted from being engaged in training and things as such, but it's not clear, again, why ownership of productive capital itself is required for their contribution to society in that kind of way. And similarly, right, if we look at the case of labor in a factory, again, labor in a factory is engaged in a kind of contribution without necessarily having to own the means of production there. So one sort of puzzle, right, in Rawls's account is why does he think that ownership of productive assets is required for people to be seen as doing their full share in the context of economic activity? I think part of it comes from a historical perspective, right? So I think one way to understand Rawls's impetus, and I think this bears out, is he had in mind, in the back of his mind, something in the United States we call yeoman farmers. So yeoman farmers are small-scale farmers, right, who own their own plot of land, right? They own their equipment, right? They own horse, mule, animals, and thereby are able to engage in productive activity, right, that is not dependent upon others and involves the ownership of some degree of the means of production. And this is an image that sort of goes back in American history, goes back to sort of certain notions of American democracy, where the thought was that one needed a class of yeoman farmers in some sense to sort of support democracy, because they would be propertied on the one hand, right? So therefore not part of the unpropertied, right? But wouldn't necessarily be so wealthy in some sense as to overwhelm, right, sort of the economic distribution. So that's sort of one image as to why we might think this is the case. Secondly, Rawls's discussion and concern about social inequalities seems to suggest that greater ownership of capital should be seen to reflect greater contribution, right? But if we go back to the idea of ownership of capital itself not being a productive activity, it's not clear to me why Rawls should think this either, right? And I think, again, this sort of has its antecedents in certain ways that we think about capitalism in the American context, where we tend to lionize and tend to view as successful, right, the entrepreneur or the people who come about to sort of be quite wealthy in certain kinds of ways. And so I think that's another thing that's sort of sitting in behind there. So if we think about Rawls's argument, then it's not clear to me that it actually gets us to the key for thinking about why we need to have more widespread distribution of the ownership of means of production if we think about his concern about social inequality and status inequality and being seen as contributing, right, one's full share to society. If anything, if we adopt the perspective of inclusivity, right, it's the other way around, right? Because if we believe inclusivity is the value and think about inclusivity, then what's really going on is that if one is not in a position to be able to contribute one's full share in the context of participating in the economy, right, then they in effect are being excluded from participation. And therefore it's because of their lower social standing, right, that they aren't in a position to be able to participate and contribute to the economy. So in some sense, actually, I think that Rawls has it the other way around if we adopt a perspective of inclusion, right? Meaning that the problem with the fact that people aren't in a position to be able to contribute fully to the economy, right, doesn't then result in them being seen as lower status. It's the other way around. It's because they have a lower social status, right, that they're being excluded from being able to participate in the economy fully and benefiting from it. So that's sort of one sort of response that I have to the Rawlsian argument. The second point is this. If we think about what's wrong with highly concentrated ownership of capital, right, it's not that there are people who lack capital and therefore lack social standing that challenges their self-respect, as I've just suggested, right? Instead, we can turn it on its head. Under highly concentrated ownership of capital, there's a group of individuals who do not need to work to enjoy the benefits of participating in the economy, right? And that, to me, is exactly the lack of inclusivity. And that, for me, is why thinking in terms of inclusive capitalism is a way to make the case for widespread ownership of capital and the means of production, but not along the lines that Rawls suggests, right? But in this negative sense, because that is exactly what allows a certain group of people not to have to work and still enjoy the benefits of participating in the economy. This is not to say that work is a bad thing necessarily. This is not to say that work has to be a hardship. But the point is that the way in which one benefits from work, which is the investment of one's time, labor, energy, emotion, right, is something about ourselves. We think about Hannah Arendt, for example. And it's also limited in how much we can earn, because it's limited by how much time and energy we have to be able to invest, right? The way in which one benefits from the ownership of capital is entirely different, right? It's not productive activity, and it, in principle, is almost limitless, right? And so in a society with highly concentrated ownership of the means of production, that represents a lack of inclusivity on the idea and approach that I've just put forward. So to conclude, I've tried to articulate and define the idea of inclusive capitalism, right? And to make the case for it by acknowledging that the idea itself may not be new, right? But I hope is perhaps maybe new enough or different enough, right, to be helpful in advancing our thinking about this issue is this idea of thinking about it from the perspective of inclusivity. And why do I say that? I take inspiration from the fact that in many other parts of our economic life today, we talk about inclusivity. We talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Usually it refers to ensuring that people haven't been marginalized for reasons of, say, historical racism, right, or sexism, are be able to be included in fully participating in the economy. So inclusion, I think, is a kind of value that seems to resonate with us today. And so my goal really in this talk and in this paper and this work is to try to say, there's a value that seems to resonate with people today. Can we use that value, right, to sort of revisit, right, and rethink and reframe, right, what really is a very old debate about the ownership of the means of production in a way that may be helpful in moving us forward from the kinds of debates that we've had that have sort of led to a certain kind of stalemate in certain kinds of ways. And I tried to make this case by basically engaging three audiences. One was business, right, that needs to now think about ownership in addition to who benefits as a stakeholder. Socialism, and raising questions about the plausibility of public ownership of the means of production as a way to realize certain democratic and personal values. And then finally, liberalism itself, right? And to sort of interrogate liberalism on its emphasis on individual autonomy, sort of an individual opportunity, and rather think more about the idea of inclusion and exclusion in the context of liberalism themselves. So I've mentioned three audiences that I've tried to engage to get to this point. And I guess in conclusion, I'd like to engage a fourth audience, which is you. I mean that both as individuals sitting in this room and the fact that we're in Germany. And I guess one question to all of you, is Germany a representative country from which we can take lessons for how we should think about the ideal of inclusive capitalism? So thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.